You know, this has been a challenging week in our country. No doubt all of us were glued to our TVs and our smartphones watching the devastation that wreaked havoc in the Southwest Florida area and region. As you know, the migration from Brooklyn to Staten Island to Jersey brings a lot of our friends and family where? Right down there to Florida. So we no doubt have people in our own families and network of friends that have been affected, and our prayers are continuing in that area and region, and we as a church will continue to pray how we might come alongside to bring hope and comfort and aid in whatever small or large ways God might call us to. But as we watched as well the news the last few days and you see the after effects of that devastation, you know what word kept coming to my mind? Rebuild. Rebuild. The men and women, the families down in that area are going to do a major work of rebuilding in the coming months and the coming years. And for those of us here on Staten Island, 10 years after the effects of Hurricane Sandy, we know sometimes how long it takes for that rebuilding effort. But what about as well the families, those that lost loved ones as a result of this catastrophe? They too as well will need to rebuild, won't they? They too as well will need to have courage and faith that only God can give to see how in the midst of this tragedy and sadness and brokenness, God could bring a new beginning. This fall, we've been studying from the book of Nehemiah this theme that with God, when we rebuild, it's never too late for God to do something new. That it's never too late for a new beginning with God. That even in the midst of things and places and relationships that seem to be in shambles around us, that with God, He is always in the business of giving new hope, new life, rebirth, and rebuilding. You know, this last week as well, talking with several individuals in our church and extended throughout our church, many families as well are in a season where they need God to rebuild, where there has been brokenness that has been confessed, where there has been sadness that has been uttered, and as a result, husband and wives need to confess and work together. Children need to humble themselves, and actually in some cases, the children need to be heard by those that are in charge as parents and listened to, and there needs to be rebuilding in families as well. You know, all of us want a life that goes always up and to the right. I mean, you place your investment in the stock market or you put it in a bank account and you want to see positive gains, don't you? We won't talk about what that's looked like on Wall Street the last few months. But if we are honest this morning, we all would definitely be there to say, listen, just like our financial investments have seasons where they go up and down and sometimes plummet, in our personal lives as well, we are not guaranteed. We are not promised an upward trajectory from the bottom left to the upward right all in our lives. There are seasons where chaos and brokenness demands of us, requires of us to rebuild. And this morning, as we continue into Nehemiah chapter 4, we're going to see that as God called Nehemiah and the nation of Israel to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, that it was not a journey that started and only went up and to the right. It was a journey that once it was started was met with great opposition. Opposition. Can you believe it? Perhaps you've been far from God for years and you've not really taken seriously the claims of the Lord. And you finally, at some point in the recent past, have come to faith in God and said, Lord, I want to follow you. God, I want to trust you. And perhaps you had in your mind this misnomer, this misinformation that now things are going to be smooth and easy. I mean, isn't that what we all like to sign up for? And now you realize that, man, as I seek to follow God and rebuild brokenness in my life, as I seek to be a person of faith, I realize that I still have struggles with temptation and doubts and difficulties. And not everybody is in my corner as much as I thought they would be. And some of you here this morning may be thinking, Lord, is it really worth it? Is the life of faith and obedience to you really worth it? And for Nehemiah, this no doubt is what happens in the mind of those around him as we find ourselves in Nehemiah chapter 4. that even though they are now starting to be obedient to God, to rebuild those walls, to see God's blessings once again come to them and to their nation and to their city, that opposition is right there. And brothers and sisters, it's a reminder for us this morning that to follow after God by faith means that there will be opposition. Are you with me? This is the sermon where everybody wishes they walked out or they came in online and now they could press, well, I'll skip Pastor Mike's message this week, Those of you online, don't turn and switch, right? That following after God in the process of rebuilding our lives, our church, our city, our world means difficulty at times and opposition. And this morning, what we see in Nehemiah chapter 4 is what I am calling a master class on facing opposition. A master class on facing opposition. How this man of God, Nehemiah, faces criticism from without and discouragement from within his own people, and how he approaches this with grace and truth and strength and a reliance on God. And if you are here this morning and you feel as if you are facing criticism from others, unwarranted criticism, we're going to talk about that. Or perhaps even in your own heart you're discouraged. Discouraged this morning as you seek to obey God and honor Him in your life. Then what we will see from Nehemiah is a model for us of how we can face it as well in our life. And ultimately, we'll see this morning as we end our message, getting ready to take of the communion elements together, that it is Jesus Himself who models for us how to face unwanted and unwarranted criticism, how to face even discouragement with those that are closest to Him, and yet being faithful to the very end. So if you're looking for encouragement to face the discouragement in your life today, then Nehemiah chapter 4 is where we need to look. This morning, what I want to do for us is lay out for us in this chapter how it goes back and forth between criticism and how to handle it, and then next, discouragement and how we are to handle it as followers of God. The first we see in verses 1 through 3, Nehemiah chapter 4. Turn with me there in your Bibles or on your phones. You could follow as well along on our screen together this morning. This is the Word of God. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became excited for us. Oh, that's Mike's version, right? He became what? Furious. He mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria and said, "What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble?" Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, "Indeed, even if a fox climbed up what they are building, he would break down their stone wall." Criticism from the outside. Criticism. We find here in these verses this realization that criticism is often personal. And it challenges your abilities, your motives, your commitment. In these first 3 verses, we see the introduction of the 2 main protagonists here for Nehemiah throughout his journey in this book, as he seeks to rebuild the wall. Sanballat and another named Tobiah. Sanballat was most likely some type of governmental leader, perhaps the governor himself of Samaria, that region just north of Judah in the land of Israel. If you remember, it was the Samaritans who had made alliances with the Assyrians generations before, allowing them to somewhat be half aligned with the plans of God and half aligned with the plans of God's enemies. The people of Samaria, as we see later on in the New Testament, had a conflicting and difficult relationship with Israel and Jerusalem. In fact, this is why we see Jesus showing such great examples of grace, going to the woman of Samaria as well as sharing the story of the Good Samaritan. It would have been a shock that a Samaritan would have been gracious and loving and kind to a Jew. And part of that reason is what we see here in this story today. These leaders who felt the threat that Israel was about to rebuild its walls became furious. They did not like any geopolitical challenge in their region. They wanted to be strong and secure and the only ones. So Sanballat, like most individuals who are critical, don't start with debating whether or not your plans are well thought out. Don't start with arguing whether or not you truly have the resources and the time and the abilities to complete the task. He does what most of us do when we feel intimidated by someone else encroaching on our territory. We make it personal. I mean, haven't you ever followed the way people comment online towards each other? Oh, none of us has. I mean, Twitter is just filled with example upon example of personal attack and criticism. And I want you to see it here in the text. Look back with me in verses 1 through 3, where we see these questions that he raises in a mocking way. What are these pathetic Jews doing? He makes it personal. He says, can they restore it by themselves? They are incompetent. Will they offer sacrifices? Here's an interesting critique. What are their real motives? Have you ever had somebody challenge and critique your motives for something? I have. Well, why do you want to be a part of this? Or why did you make that decision? Or really, why do you hold that stance on this topic of the day? What are your motives? They must be for personal gain. And here, Sanballat, not really caring whether or not worship would start again and sacrifices would begin again in Jerusalem, challenges their motives and says, will they offer burnt sacrifices? Are they really going back to worship God? Challenges of one's motives is often so personal and painful. He goes on and says this, can they bring these stones back to life? Will they ever finish it? Where are your abilities? What are your motives? And do you have the commitment to finish the job? And then we see as well Tobiah kind of standing along the side. To me, he looks kind of like the sidekick to Sanballat here in this great criticism that is brought. We see him on the side saying, yeah, and even if a fox climbed up that wall, he could tear it down. Can't you just see the little comic relief here? He has this little sidekick saying, yeah, you're unable, and man, I could see what you've started, and it's not that impressive. Criticism. Now, I want to make sure this morning we understand the difference between valid correction in our life and unwarranted criticism. All of us fall short. None of us do things perfectly. No leader is ever beyond some type of challenge or correction, ways that they could be more faithful, ways that they could improve, ways that they could honor God. There's a difference in our life between receiving correction. As the scriptures say, faithful are the wounds of a friend. The Proverbs teach us that faithful are the wounds of a friend, that correction is necessary. There's a difference between valid correction in our life and unwarranted criticism. And some of us need to listen to some more correction because it's from the Lord and it's from godly advice and counsel, but we need to develop a way of responding when people attack you personally, challenge your motives, challenge your abilities in a way that brings you down. Remember for Nehemiah, we talked about this last week. Nehemiah understood that he was submissive to God's sovereign and revealed will. Nehemiah knew that as he was being faithful then as a result in whatever way God called him to do, as he calls you and I to do so in different ways in our life, that as long as he is humbly following God's sovereign and revealed will as best as he knows how to, he can in peace walk out in faith and obedience. Larry Osborne talks about the difference between correction and criticism. He says, oftentimes we may be expecting the precise scalpel of correction, but yet we get the blunt axe of criticism. We're diagnosing the need here before we see the prognosis of how to respond. It is often sharp and painful. And many of us here today are still weighted down by unwarranted criticism that had been put on us even from childhood to this day. Even so now, as you seek to follow God in this new stage and season of life, perhaps as an adult, decades later, you still hear those critical words in your ear. I remember it was, 15 years ago when I first started in pastoral ministry, coming out of seminary on a full-time basis. And I thought to myself, well, I'm a pastor now at this church. People are obviously going to like me all the time. Or I'm a pastor. I have to do everything perfectly. And I remember it was just a few months in, and I was doing something that wasn't 100% right. It wasn't anything evil or wrong or sinful, but it was an area that I could have improved in. But an individual came up to me, pointed out that error, and then unloaded a dump truck of personal attacks. Can you believe it? Just like personal attacks. At first I heard his critique, or his correction, and thought, that's a good idea. And then he mocked everything from my ability to the way I looked, which made me know that couldn't be right, Have you ever felt that? Just that weight. We see in Nehemiah this case where it would have been easy at that point for him to say, this ain't worth it. I'm going to go back to Persia and hang out with the king. But we see him respond in a very different way, and what I think as well could help us, model for us how we are to respond. Look at what he does in verse 4 in responding to criticism from the outside. He says, listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt, or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have angered the builders. Verse 6, so we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had the will to keep working. Do you see his response? Do you see how Nehemiah here responds when he receives unwarranted, unjust, personal attacks on his abilities, his motives, his competencies? Nehemiah does not return back and say, oh yeah? Which, if you're like me, that's normally your response. In fact, I remember when this individual had come to me, challenging me in very personal ways, I remember getting up and feeling heat and anger and the blood going out of my face and starting in church to walk down an aisle aggressively to argue with him. And I thought, well, I gave it 3 months as a pastor. It didn't last much longer than that. I'm going to get into a fight in the aisles after 3 months at this church, I mean, don't we often want to respond back in that way? I know I did. I know I do at times. But look at what Nehemiah does. When faced with criticism, he prays an honest prayer, and he is persistent in his task. I want to go back and look at that prayer with you again here. And this is not your cleaned up, pretty Sunday school prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you for the sun and the birds. God, thank you for bagels and coffee between services. No. Look at this prayer. He says, listen, God, we are despised. Lord, I'm in a terrible spot. Make their insults return on their heads. Let them be taken to captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from their sights. I mean, this is not a wishy-washy prayer, is it? This is what's called in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, an imprecatory prayer, where you are praying that God's justice would go upon those who are your greatest accusers. He is praying, Lord, may they experience the just consequences of their sinful ways. Now, you may be reading and seeing this and thinking, wow, Pastor Mike, doesn't sound very Christian. I mean, here we see these individuals praying these imprecatory prayers, these really prayers crying out that things would happen to those that might hurt you. But I want you to notice the tone and the purpose of these prayers. He says, Lord, you do the one to. Lord, you do the work of justice. God, I don't take it in my own hands. I do what? I lay it at yours. You could read all of the Psalms. In fact, read Psalm 35, Psalm 137 later on today. You see the words of the psalmist, oftentimes so raw and honest like this, that God, I want to see justice, and Lord, I trust it to you. And this morning, for those of us that are facing criticism, perhaps unwarranted, it is not an invitation to take justice and power into our own hands. It is an opportunity to humble ourselves and honestly pray and seek God out and say, Lord, bring about justice. Lord, for those that might use their words and their actions to hurt and demean and harm me, Lord, I lay them into your care, and Lord, I say, your will be done. It's a psalm and a prayer of honesty this morning. Are you honest with the Lord like this? For those individuals that may be in your mind right now that are still difficult to think about. Perhaps people that for you to even be in their presence weighs upon you. God invites us to honestly pray and say, Lord, I lift them up to you. To not say, Lord, justice is mine, and God, I'll demand it in my time and in my way. But Lord, as I face criticism, I am going to trust this individual to you, knowing that you are just and merciful God. And just as you have shown justice and mercy towards me in my life, God, I trust you to do the same in theirs. It's an act of humble faith. That's the beginning point this morning. Will you do that? Will I do that? When criticism comes, will you trust it? Secondly, as well, we see in verse 6 here that he persists in the task. I love this. He says, so we rebuilt the entire wall to half its height. Verse 6. We kept working. When receiving unwarranted criticism, when receiving attacks from others that might challenge your motives, your abilities, your commitment, we prayerfully surrender them to God and his justice, and we don't stop doing what God has called us to do. Are you with me this morning? And we need to, in those moments, even more so, trust that God is at work. That just because criticism has popped up, it does not invalidate the work that we are a part of. That just because you maybe are not being understood as you try to work towards reconciliation with your spouse, it is not an excuse to say, I give up. It is an invitation to persist even more in grace and truth and forgiveness and love. It's an opportunity to keep doing the right thing and trusting him. I remember it was years later. I was sitting up on the platform of that same church. And out in this section over here, I'm not calling Debbie out, even though you're sitting right there, but it's right where Debbie was sitting. I saw this same guy years later. And I remember sitting up there thinking, oh yeah, I'm ready to go back. Right before I'm getting ready to preach, man, you need a better pastor around here. You need a more holy guy around. I'm thinking, oh yeah. I'm ready to defend myself again. I'm ready to go tell him why he was wrong. I can't wait to. And the Lord humbled me. I went after the service up to greet him, and he looked me in the eye. I will never forget it. He looked me in the eye and said, hello, I haven't seen you in a long time. And he looked up at me and said, hello, I want to say I'm sorry. And I said to him, man, I want to say I'm sorry too for getting a little angry that day too. And you know, we're not BFFs. We don't follow each other on Instagram. But we were reconciled. We forgave. We moved forward. And God calls us to do the same, to trust His justice in His time and to be faithful to the task. Some of us have given up before we have been faithful when we face criticism. But as we move on here and we see, it's not just criticism, but lastly this morning, it's about discouragement. Not only when we are facing opposition, when we are rebuilding things according to God's time and His way, will we get criticized, will we get challenged, where we have to humble ourselves, trust people to the Lord, and continue to be faithful to what He's called us to do. Here we see as well that even on the inside, the people are struggling. When they had plotted, verse 8, you see, together to come and fight against us, verse 9, we prayed to our God and stationed a guard between them day and night. And in Judah it was said, here's where I want you to see the discouragement. In Judah, the nation of Israel's most perhaps prominent of tribes, the one through whom the Lion of Judah would come, who is? I give you an opportunity every week. Your Sunday school answer. The answer is Jesus. Let's be ready now. Come on, all right? In your own Bibles, if you see your printed Bibles, this section, this verse is closed off in a center paragraph in most printed Bibles. Why? Because as they follow the grammar of it and the way it's laid out in the original, it has markings of something either being a poem or a song. So this one verse here in verse 11, in verse 10 in your Bibles, is probably marked out in a different way to demarcate that it's a song, it's a poem of some sorts. Here's what many scholars believe. They believe that this might have been a little ditty that the builders were singing as they're rebuilding the wall. Kind of like, hi-ho, it's off to work. Okay, all right. So listen to the encouraging song they are singing to each other as they're rebuilding the wall. In Judah it was said, the strength of the laborer fails, since there is so much rubble. We will never be able to rebuild the wall. I mean, do you want to work with this group of people? If I asked Allison, I know she could put that to music and make that a little ditty that reminds us. As we go about rebuilding our families, you know, we will never be able to rebuild our marriage. Yay! We will never be able to rebuild our relationship with our child. We will never be able to rebuild our community. We will never be able to rebuild as a church. The words of discouragement have become so commonplace, even for the people of God, that they put it to music. And some of us are so discouraged because of things that we have been praying for and trying for and trusting God for years and years and years. We're discouraged, and while we don't have a song and a ditty in our head, it might as well be as if we did. Because discouragement has become so commonplace. Here we see that discouragement is difficult to get past on our own. That these men and women from this tribe and in this area, as they are experiencing the challenge before them, are facing this great discouragement. And they feel all alone. And some of us here this morning feel like we are the only one that is trying to make this situation work. Some of us here this morning may be feeling like there's no one else that is picking up this mantle with me. Some of us here this morning may be feeling as if years and years of waiting for this situation, this relationship, to finally have some answer, perhaps it's time to throw in the towel. And discouragement has become a song of your soul. Remember, in verse 6, it tells us that they had rebuilt how much of the wall? Half of it. Half of it. That halfway up the journey towards rebuilding the whole wall is when this real opposition of discouragement came to the forefront. And many of us are in the midst of rebuilding projects in our life. Things that we have been confessing and a lifestyle that we have said, God, I want to go a different way. I want to honor you. And we're only halfway down that process of really changing. And at the midpoint is when it's often easiest to want to give up. Imagine seeing that wall halfway done, still observing all the rubble, experiencing the outside criticism, and as the nation and as the tribe of Judah thinking, we're only halfway there, and it is not easy. Any rebuild effort, no doubt, hits a snag somewhere in that midway process where you still see the challenges and you feel the disappointment. So, how do we respond? We see it here quickly as we close. Nehemiah offers for us not an exhaustive way to respond, but I think a very thorough way for you and I to respond when experiencing discouragement and how that personally affects us in our life when the walls are only halfway completed. He says is in verse 13 and 14 and in verse 20 this. He says, so I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall at the vulnerable areas. I stationed them alone. Is that what he says? I stationed them by families with their swords and spears and bows. And after I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Listen to his words. Don't be afraid. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Verse 20, he gives them a new ditty to sing. He says, whenever you hear the trumpet sound, rally to us there. And he gives the words, our God will fight for us. Do you see it? Discouragement. When we are faced within our lives, we are to unify ourselves. We are to come around beside those who are like-minded to the task at hand. When we face discouragement and it becomes so personal and insular, so much so that it weighs us down, the thing we need to do first is open our eyes, look up, and find others that we could go with to the battle. He says here that he united them by their families. That they were working side by side. That the men and the women and the children, they came together and they said, what might we do together? What might we do to face discouragement at the halfway point? And notice what he does. He focuses them again on God's help. He says in verse, some of you, this needs to be your life verse this week, verse 14. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord and fight. Don't be afraid. Remember God and fight. Fight for your family. Fight for the brokenness. Fight for your relationships to be healed in ways that only He can. We need each other and we need focus to make it through the discouraging times. 10 years ago on our island, we were faced with our own hurricane or superstorm that was a travesty in our area. Many of us were a part of that. Some of us lived in areas like that. Perhaps some individuals here even lost loved ones or they were affected greatly. I know that Gateway Church at that season of time had an important work during that season of housing relief efforts and using our chapel as a storage area to bring resources to others on our island. You remember how that was and the effort it took. The previous church I was a part of, we committed $250,000 to efforts of rebuilding in the region, some here on the island and in other places. It's 10 years now. I can't believe it. And in the months afterwards, I did a lot of muck out projects. Was anybody a part of any of those mucking out efforts? We'd go down to various houses or apartments and start to tear out the walls and the furniture because mold was starting to be brought in. They were calling them mucking things out. And I remember I was with a friend of mine, a good friend of mine. His name is Tom, who led a lot of these efforts, Tom Basil on the island. And I remember I learned so much from watching him during that time. He said, when you bring a team to muck out a house, he says you got to set them off with the right tools right away, and you have to come back in the middle of the day. And I asked him, I said, why? I said, you give individuals a task, and then you come back and you report in later on, right? He said, no. Come midday, guess what happens? Discouragement, despair, overwhelming disappointment start to come in. I have been working for 4 hours, and there is a lot of junk still in here. And so our job on some of these efforts were to go around to the different places and work with the team for 30 to 40 minutes to inspire them with outside help, that they're not alone, that what they're doing is important. And we did it for 30, 40 minutes. And you know what you saw with the teams that were working? A renewed energy to do what? Finish the task. And for some of us this morning, we need to play that role in the life of somebody else. We need to come alongside them in their midst of their halfway rebuilding project in their life and say, I'm with you. You're not alone. The task is worth it. The reconciliation is worth it. The changed life is worth it. The impact you could have is worth it. I am with you because God is with you, and we together will face this rebuild. Are you with me? What if we were known as a church of men and women that are ready to jump in, especially at the midway point, and say, I'm with you to the end? I think of Galatians 6. Let us not become weary in doing good. For in the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Here's the bottom line this morning from Nehemiah 4. Rebuilding what's broken in our lives will always invite criticism and discouragement. Do not believe falsely that you are beyond that or won't receive it. But how we respond is up to us. Will we honestly pray to God and persist in faithfulness to the task? Will we unite with like-minded men and women of faith? And will we focus on the one who's going to do the work for us in the end? Ultimately, we look to the example of Jesus, who faced outside criticism, didn't he? He faced the opposition from the outside of the political and religious leaders of their day who were challenging his motives, challenging his competency, challenging his character, and yet he was led like a lamb, humbly. We see Jesus as well facing discouragement from within, didn't he? That even those that were closest to him were like dumbfounded to what he was actually sharing. That they as well gave up halfway through, and Jesus finds himself in the garden after the officials come, and he is all alone. We see Jesus in that garden even crying out to God, Lord, let this cup what? Make it pass. That Jesus is accustomed to what it feels like to experience discouragement and unwarranted criticism. And as we sang this morning, he was faithful yet to the task that was given to him. And because of that, we are forgiven. We have hope. We have a future. With God, it is never too late for a new beginning. Trust him for it today. When the opposition rises, look to the example of Nehemiah, and ultimately look to Jesus to be faithful to the end.